Now, next on the docket, we have Frank Turek joining us. He is a world renowned Christian debater, dynamic speaker, award winning author. He's a captain of Q&A and he's an aviator turned apologist. The list of titles is long for Frank Turek, who currently serves as the president of crossexamine.org. His well known books include I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist and Stealing from God. When not speaking at colleges and universities, Frank Turek is busy hosting his radio and TV shows. Over the course of the years, Frank Turek has debated leading atheist speakers like the late Christopher Hitchens and David Silverman, former president of American Atheists, to name a few. Let me also remind you, attendees, to also hold on to your questions until the roundtable Q&A sessions, where you can enter your questions into the Q&A tab. Now, over to you, Mr. Frank Turek.
Hey, thank you so much, Stephen. Good morning. At least it's morning for me here in Charlotte, North Carolina. Let me share a screen with you right now so we can move forward. Let me see if I can share the right screen. Hang on a second. All right, you guys tell me if, hold on, I'm getting there. I'm a little technically challenged on this software, but I'm going to get there. Tell me if you can see, what do you see there, Stephen, on the screen? Can anybody tell me what they see?
Yes, I'm able to see the University of Wisconsin at Madison, able to see
Perfect.
your presentation.
All right, here we go. Let's start here at the University of Wisconsin at Madison. This is actually a picture from one of our campus events from several years ago. What we do is we present I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist on college campuses around the country, sometimes even overseas. And then we set up a microphone so any student can ask a question. And I had just gone through the evidence that God exists. I had gone through the cosmological argument, which shows that there was a beginning to the universe, and the universe had a beginning out of nothing, meaning that whatever caused the universe had to be spaceless, timeless, immaterial, powerful, personal, and intelligent. Because if space, time, and matter had a beginning out of nothing, then whatever created space, time, and matter can't be made as space, time, and matter. The cause must transcend space, time, and matter. So I had just given that argument and that evidence and several lines of evidence from the book, I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. And one gentleman was in the Q&A line. He got up to the microphone and he looked a little bit older than a typical undergraduate. He had long hair, he had a ponytail, and he had this shirt on, Bad Religion, with a negation over the cross. So I immediately knew this man was open-minded. Anyway, after I just gave the evidence that a spaceless, timeless, immaterial being must exist that created the universe, he said, can you think of anything else that is spaceless, timeless, and immaterial other than God? And I said, well, yes, the laws of logic are spaceless, timeless, and immaterial. And he said, well, I would argue then that the laws of logic don't exist. And I said, so you're saying they do exist? And he said, no, I'm saying they don't exist. And I said, no, you're saying they do exist. And he said, no, I'm saying they don't exist. I say, you're saying they do exist. He said, why do you think I'm saying they do exist? I said, because you're using the laws of logic right now to contradict what I'm saying. You're using the very laws you are claiming don't exist. And he didn't really like that. So we went back and forth a little bit, and he finally tried to say that the laws of logic were just grounded in human minds. In other words, these laws are just human conventions. And so I said to him, let me ask you a question. Before there were any human minds on the earth, was the statement, there are no human minds on the earth, true? Well, he didn't really like that either, but he finally had to admit, yeah, it would be true, even though there were no human minds to even know that. It would still be true that the statement, there are no human minds on the earth, that statement would still be true. So the laws of logic can't be grounded merely in human minds. There must be something beyond human minds to ground the laws of logic. So in one sense, he was correct that the laws must be grounded in a mind somewhere, but not just human minds. Because in the absence of human minds, things would still be true. It would still be true there are no human minds before there were any human minds. So I say that to introduce our topic today. And by the way, you could probably go on YouTube and actually find that interaction. It was filmed. It's up there somewhere. But our discussion today is going to be on the fact that I think atheists are stealing from God to argue against him. And they do this in several ways by the acronym CRIMES, C-R-I-M-E-S. They steal causality, reason, information, morality, evil, and science. Many of these things they say point away from God, that God does not exist. But my position is none of these things would exist unless God existed, including what we're going to talk about first, and that is reason. And then a little bit later, we'll get into the issue of morality. Why does reason point to God? Well, these atheists, prominent atheists, one of them, a couple of them have passed on. At the top left corner is David Silverman. In the middle is Daniel Dennett. On the right top, of course, is Richard Dawkins. The bottom right is Christopher Hitchens, who, as you know, died about 10 years ago. I had a couple of debates with Christopher that you can see on our YouTube channel, crossexamine.org. And then the man on the bottom left is Steven Weinberg, a physicist from UT Austin, who has also recently died. And yet these people consider themselves free thinkers. Free thinkers. My contention to you is that there is no free and there is no thinking going on if materialistic atheism is true. And all these men here are materialists. They think that everything that exists are materials. There is a fundamental problem, a number of fundamental problems with thinking that all that exists are molecules, with thinking that just materials exist, with thinking that we are completely determined by the laws of physics. Let me show you why. Suppose someone were to say to you, some atheist, some materialist were to say to you, all thoughts are determined by the laws of physics. What question might you ask that person back? You might say, is that one too determined by the laws of physics? Because if that thought right there is determined by the laws of physics, why should I believe it? Why should I think anything that I think is true if every thought I have is the result of the laws of physics? In other words, I don't have free will. I'm just a molecular machine. I'm just a moist robot. Well, that's what these atheists think. We're just moist robots. Now, all you can see we're doing here is we're turning the claim on itself. We're turning the claim on itself, which is what we talk about a lot, not only in Stealing from God, but the previous book, I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. If you can turn a claim on itself, you can demonstrate that it's false and shouldn't be believed. You know, it's a self-defeating statement to say all thoughts are determined by the laws of physics. Well, if all thoughts are determined by the laws of physics, so is that one. So why should I believe it? It's self-defeating to say there's no truth. You simply ask them. If you turn the claim on itself, if they say there's no truth, you simply ask them, is that true, that there's no truth? It's self-defeating to say you can't know anything. You just simply turn the claim on itself and say, well, how can you know that then if you can't know anything? It's self-defeating to say there are no absolutes. You might just want to ask them, is that an absolute? Or are you absolutely sure? It's self-defeating to say all truth comes from science. Why? Because that truth doesn't come from science. If it's true at all, it doesn't come from science. It's a philosophical claim. It defeats itself. I mean, it's like saying I can't speak a word in English. That's what self-defeating statements are. For me to say I can't speak a word in English, of course, I'd have to speak English, which would defeat my claim. In other words, if the claim is true, it's false. It's nonsense. So you have to get good at pointing out that self-defeating statements don't work. In fact, JBS Haldane knew this. he was a evolutionist and a materialist, but he realized there was a problem with his own belief system because robots can't reason. So why believe anything? Here's how he put it. He said, if my mental processes are determined wholly by the motions of atoms in my brain, I have no reason to suppose that my beliefs are true. And hence I have no reason for supposing my brain to be composed of atoms, right? It's a self-defeating statement. In fact, C.S. Lewis put this better than anybody. Here's what Lewis said about the fact that materialistic atheism makes reason impossible. This is a 2-slide quote, so stay with me here. Here's how Lewis put it. He said, suppose there was no intelligence behind the universe. In that case, nobody designed my brain for the purpose of thinking. Thought is merely the byproduct of some atoms within my skull. But if so, how can I trust my own thinking to be true? But if I can't trust my own thinking, of course I can't trust the arguments leading to atheism, and therefore have no reason to be an atheist or anything else. Unless I believe in God, I can't believe in thought, so I can never use thought to disbelieve in God. Now, I don't know about you, but I think C.S. Lewis deserves a round of applause for that, okay? Because you can't say it any better than that. Because if you don't believe in God, you can't believe in thought, so you can never use thought to disbelieve in God. This is the universal problem with materialism. It's a problem with atheism. In fact, let me back up for a second. When people say to you, how do you know that God exists? What you ought to say to them is, I know God by his effects. In other words, we have these effects and we reason back to a cause of the effect. So if I have the ability to reason, that's the effect. I want to reason back to a cause, and that cause would be a mind. Because if I can reason and I have these laws of logic which allow me to reason, then I've got that's an effect that I need to explain. How do I explain the effect of reason? Well, I reason back to a cause, a mind. You go from effect back to cause. That's what scientists do. How do I know that God exists? Because there are effects that need to be explained, and the best explanation for some of these effects is what we would call God. Reason is one of them. The universe itself is another. In other words, there's a creation. If there's a creation, that's the effect. You reason back to a cause, a creator. You have design. That's an effect. The universe is designed. It's fine-tuned. The life is designed. You're reasoning back to a cause, a designer. You have a moral law written on your heart. Certain things are right. Other things are wrong. We'll get to that in a few minutes, by the way, when we talk about morality. So you must reason back to a cause, a moral lawgiver. So you know there must be a being out there that is the cause of all these effects, a being who's a creator, who's a designer, who's moral, who's intelligent, who has a mind. These are what we call the attributes of God. So you're reasoning from effect to cause. You shouldn't give up on your thinking. You shouldn't say, oh, well, I guess if materialism is true, I shouldn't trust anything I think. You should say, I know I can trust things I think. And if I know I can trust things I think, I have to have a cause for that. What's the cause for the laws of logic? What's the cause for my mind? What's the cause for an orderly world, which allows us to reason and do science? It must be an orderly mind that has organized this reality and sustains this reality. So I think Lewis is spot on here. Another atheist that I mentioned earlier, one of the first atheists I mentioned was Daniel Dennett, who said this, that consciousness is an illusion. Well, one wonders if Dennett was conscious when he wrote that or when he said that. Notice he has to have consciousness to write or say anything, correct? If it's an illusion, then he shouldn't even trust his own consciousness. Now, notice the big problem here is that atheists exempt themselves from their own theories. They'll say everybody's a molecular machine, except me, the atheist. I'm not a molecular machine. I can follow the evidence where it leads. They'll say consciousness is an illusion, except me. My consciousness is not an illusion. I need consciousness so I can write books that say consciousness is an illusion. You see the problem here? Atheists exempt themselves from their own theories. So let's deal with the question directly then. Where do the laws of logic come from? Do they come from mind or do they come from matter? In fact, as John Lennox has said, there's really only two worldviews at the end of the day. Either mind gave rise to matter or matter gave rise to mind. Now, we know that, first of all, matter is created. It's not eternal. We also know that matter decomposes and must be composed as well. We also know that matter had a beginning, and we know that matter by itself is dumb. If that's the case, ultimate reality must be mind, not matter. Mind gave rise to matter. Matter did not give rise to mind. Now, with the laws of logic, to deny them is to use them. Like my University of Wisconsin grad student, when he said, well, I don't believe the laws of logic exist then. Well, he's using the law of non-contradiction to contradict what I was saying. So he does believe they exist. Anytime you deny them, you're using them. Secondly, immaterial, unchangeable laws of logic are objective. They're outside of ourselves. They're not just my opinion or your opinion. They're not human conventions or opinions. These laws exist independently of what you or I think about them. In fact, we can't learn anything without them. They are unchangeable, self-evident tools we use to discover everything else. How do you know anything exists? How do you know there's an external world out there that you can discover and draw valid conclusions about? Well, first of all, you use your senses to get data from outside the world or from the outside world into your mind. And then you use the laws of logic to draw conclusions about what you're witnessing through your senses. Those laws of logic you don't create. Those laws of logic you use to learn everything else that you possibly can learn. The laws of logic are a bridge to the outside world in between minds. So, for example, if we were to say that the laws of logic are just human opinion, first of all, that statement wouldn't be just a human opinion. We would put it forth as if it's some objective truth. But if all the laws of logic are not objective, if they're just in the subject, if they're just my opinion or your opinion, then we couldn't have anything like objective truths, because the very laws that we're basing all of our opinions on are opinions themselves. So it would be subjective all the way down. And we obviously know that's not true. But look, if I had my own idea of the laws of logic, if I had my own conception of what the laws of logic are, and you had your own conception of what the laws of logic are, we couldn't communicate. There would be no way for me to transmit data to your mind, because if I'm using different laws than you're using, how could we even understand one another? We couldn't. You see, these laws are grounded in the nature of God. This is why God, by the way, can't be logically contradictory. He can't make a square circle. He can't make a one-ended stick. He can't make an honest politician, right? These things are illogical, right? They're absurd. You can't make a square circle. You can't make a one-ended stick, because by definition, a circle is not square. By definition, a stick has two ends, not one. So even God can't create things that are illogical. They would go against his nature. And those laws that we use to communicate and understand one another are therefore grounded in him. They're not grounded in my opinion or your opinion. They exist independent of what we think about. Now, what about this idea that Jesus is the truth? He said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. What does he mean by he's the truth? Well, it would mean that since truth corresponds to reality, anything that disagrees with reality would be untrue. And anything that disagrees with Jesus, or anyone that disagrees with Jesus, would be uttering something that's false. In fact, if you just think about it in a simple syllogism, is truth grounded in God? Well, the common definition of truth is truth corresponds to reality. Well, if truth corresponds to reality, we know that ultimate reality is God. Ultimate reality is God. We just said that, look, there's only two possible worldviews. Either mind gave rise to matter or matter gave rise to mind. We just pointed out that matter couldn't have given rise to mind because, first of all, matter had a beginning, matter's composed, matter breaks down, matter is not eternal, matter is dumb by itself, it doesn't know anything. So ultimate reality must be mind, and God is the ultimate mind. So ultimate reality is God, therefore truth corresponds to God. Anything that corresponds to God is true. Anything that disagrees with God would be false. Now, there are people that have written on this extensively. I'm giving a very simplified version of this. Probably one of the better books on this topic and many others regarding philosophical arguments for God comes from Ed Feser. This book, 5 Proofs of the Existence of God. So if you really want to get into this from a philosophical perspective, this would probably be one of the better books to get. It is one of the better books to get, 5 Proofs of the Existence of God. So truth ultimately is grounded in God. Now, you might not be able to convince an atheist of this, but as soon as an atheist says something like, well, I think it's true that God does not exist, or even if they say, I think it's true that I lack a belief in God, well, they're uttering some objective truth claim. They think that's objectively true. Well, is it just your opinion? It can't be just your opinion if it's objectively true. It's got to be grounded in some mind other than your own. And that mind is God. All right. Now, let's talk about morality. Is morality grounded in God? My argument is that truth certainly, and the laws of logic are certainly grounded in God. I think it's an easy case to make that the laws of logic must be grounded in a mind somewhere. They're certainly not made of molecules. You don't find the laws of logic in your drawer somewhere. They're not made of carbon or hydrogen. Laws of logic are immaterial and grounded in a mind. What about morality, however? Well, there are 3 arguments we typically go through for the existence of God. As you know, one is the cosmological argument. The other is the teleological argument. Let's talk a little bit about the moral argument for the existence of God. And the reason that this argument might be the most relevant to people today is that people today can ignore the beginning, they can ignore design, but it's really hard to ignore morality because we deal with it every day. Atheists on college campuses, they may claim they're atheists, but they still believe that certain things are really right and other things are really wrong. And whether it's a leftist cause or a cause on the right, they think whatever they're believing is objectively true about morality. You know, slavery's wrong, racism's wrong. Oh, yeah, we all agree. Okay, that's all wrong. But how can it be wrong if there's no God? It would be just your opinion. In fact, we're going to get into that. In fact, let's start with the universal game that just about every country knows, and that is soccer. Let me ask you a question. How do you know that your team scoring a goal in the game of soccer is better than the opponent scoring a goal in the game of soccer? How do you know that? Some say, well, the rules, okay, the rules might help, but it's not really the rules that help you know that your team scoring a goal is better than your opponent's team scoring a goal. The only way you know that your team scoring a goal is better than your opponent's team scoring the goal is you know the overall purpose of the game. There's got to be a purpose for you to say that my team scoring a goal is better than the other team. If there's no purpose, if there was no purpose that said the team that scores the most goals wins, then how could you say that your team scoring a goal is better than the other team scoring the goal? You need to know purpose in order to say this is a good play for our team, this is a bad play for our team. If there is no purpose, you can't distinguish between good, bad, right or wrong, pragmatic or non-pragmatic. because you have to be able to say that this takes us closer to the goal where this other play takes us further away. Now, notice that in soccer, or sometimes called football overseas, the purpose of the game comes from outside the game. In other words, when the players show up on the field, they're not making up the rules. The rules are established long before they ever step on the field. And the purpose is for your team to score more goals than the other team. Now, there may be secondary purposes. There's entertainment, there's exercise and all that. But once the players are on the field, their purpose is to ultimately score more goals than the other team. Now, obviously, the rules of soccer are arbitrary. They could be different. But the rules of life are not arbitrary. They come from the ultimate source of our being, the ultimate creator. They are coming from the nature of God himself. And if that being does not exist, you can't say that one particular behavior in this life is good and another particular behavior in this life is bad, because if there is no purpose, how can you say this is a good behavior or a bad play or a bad behavior? In a game, how can you say this is a good play or a bad play if you don't know the purpose? You can't. In fact, think about it this way. How can you discover who's right and who's wrong? For those of you that don't know, the lady on the left is Mother Teresa. She died about 25 years ago, but most of her life she spent in Calcutta, India, serving the poor and the suffering. The man on the right, of course, is the murderous dictator Hitler, who killed 6 million Jews and 6 million non-Jews in World War II. So how can you discover who's right and who's wrong? Well, you say, well, Mother Teresa loved people and Hitler killed them. Yeah, but how do you know it's right to love and wrong to kill? How can you why is that the right way to live, to love people rather than kill them? In fact, let's look at it a different way. How do you know which map of Scotland is better? Is it map A or map B? Well, what would you need to see in order to discover which map is better? You would need a real unchanging place called Scotland, right? I mean, if Scotland didn't exist, then these two maps would be meaningless. But since Scotland does exist, we can see that map A, while it's not perfect, is a better representation of the real Scotland than is map B. In other words, we have an external referent that we can measure both of these maps by. And we can say, after measuring these maps, that map A measures up to the real Scotland better than map B. Well, that's the same thing we do when we compare Mother Teresa and Hitler. Mother Teresa wasn't the standard. Hitler wasn't the standard. There's a standard beyond both of them by which we measure both of them. And God's moral nature is the unchanging standard of measurement. If God did not exist, there would be no way to say Mother Teresa was better than Hitler, because without a standard outside of both of them, it would just be human opinion. Well, I prefer Mother Teresa's behaviors better than Hitler's. Well, preference isn't what we're talking about here. How can we know that Mother Teresa's behavior was objectively better than Hitler's? Not just my opinion, not just your opinion. There must be an objective standard outside of both of them. And that's what we mean by God's nature. By the way, this answers what is often brought up by atheists as the Euthyphro dilemma. This is supposed to be some sort of objection to this argument. And it goes like this. It comes from a dialogue that in one of Plato's writings, where Euthyphro says, does God do it because it's good, or is it good because God does it? In other words, does God do something because it's good? In other words, does he look to a standard beyond himself and say, oh, it's good? Okay, I'll do that. Or is God arbitrary? Does he just make up goodness? And today he calls love good. Tomorrow he may call rape good. In other words, he's arbitrary. And what the atheist will say, look, you don't need God. If God's looking at a standard beyond him, why do you need God? You can look at that standard without him. Or why would you need God if he's just making up right and wrong? He's arbitrary, right? So either it makes God unnecessary because he's looking to a standard beyond him, or it makes God arbitrary by him just saying, well, I'm going to call love good today and rape bad, right, or rape good tomorrow. It's arbitrary. You don't need God either way. Now, this is supposed to be a dilemma, ladies and gentlemen. Well, it's not a dilemma at all, because a true dilemma is when you have only two choices. Either the answer is A or the answer is non-A. Well, in this case, there are more than two choices. It's not A or non-A. This is a false dilemma. God doesn't look at a standard beyond him and say, oh, that's good, I'll do it. If that were the case, he wouldn't be God. The standard outside of himself would be God. And God doesn't arbitrarily make up right and wrong. In other words, he just makes up a standard. God is the standard. You see, that's the third option. It's not one option or a second option. There's a third option. The third option, God is the standard. The buck has to stop somewhere, and it stops with God's nature. If God doesn't exist, everything's a matter of opinion. In fact, if there is no God, the Nazis were not wrong. The Nazis were not wrong. In fact, I had a debate with David Silverman a number of years ago. At the time, he was the president of the American Atheists. And he was a materialist as well. And I kept asking him the question, how can you say the Nazis were wrong if there's no God? It would just be your opinion against Adolf Hitler's opinion, if there's no standard beyond you and him. Well, he finally admitted, you're right, the Nazis were not really wrong. Now, look, I said to him, David, when your worldview tells you that the Nazis were not really wrong, don't change your intuition that murdering people is wrong. Change your worldview that tries to tell you that murder isn't wrong. You got the wrong worldview if you're going to say the Nazis were not wrong. And by the way, how did we convict the Nazis in World War II? How were we able to tell them that they were wrong? Because they said, look, we were just obeying our government. Our government told us that we had to kill these people who, and by the way, the government told us that they weren't really people. They were kind of subhuman. That's why we killed them. What did we say at the Nuremberg trials? The Allies, what did the Allies say? You had a moral obligation to disobey an immoral order because your government was not God. There's a standard beyond your government and a standard beyond our government. That standard is God's nature. Sometimes it's called international law. Sometimes, as C.S. Lewis called it, he called it the moral law. Thomas Jefferson, in the Declaration of Independence, called it nature's law. In other words, there's a standard beyond governments by which you can judge whether the Nazis were right or the Allies were right, or the Nazis were wrong or the Nazis or the Allies were wrong. You've got to have a standard beyond the governments. And we appealed to that standard in the Nuremberg trials. If there is no standard beyond governments, then how can you say the Nazis were wrong? You can't, but we know they were, so there must be a standard beyond governments. Love is no better than rape if there is no God. Well, you may prefer love better, but it's not really better because there's no purpose to life. In fact, if you're saying the purpose of life is some sort of Darwinian survival, well, maybe rape is something that actually enhances survival. So how could you say rape was wrong if survival was the goal? If there is no God, there are no human rights. On college campuses in particular, people have a very robust sense of right and wrong, a very robust sense of justice. We have to have justice, and people have certain rights. But many of these people on college campuses are atheists. Well, if there is no God, there are no human rights because there's no right giver. There's no purpose to life. There's no right or wrong. It's just someone's opinion against somebody else's opinion. Governments don't give rights. Governments are supposed to secure rights according to the United States Declaration of Independence. It says, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men were created and endowed by their government. No, endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And governments are instituted among men, not to give rights, not to take away rights, but to secure rights. And Thomas Jefferson and his cohorts who wrote the Declaration of Independence said, when a government fails to do this, when a government fails to secure God-given human rights, the people have the right to get a new government. So that's why they were declaring their independence from King George. If there is no God, murder and slavery aren't wrong. In fact, nothing's right or wrong. Everything is a matter of opinion. If there is no God, tolerance is no better than intolerance. Now, Christians out there, are Christians commanded to be tolerant? Be careful how you answer this. No. Why? Christians are not commanded to be tolerant. They're commanded to be loving. You see, tolerance is too weak. Tolerance says, hold your nose and put up with them. Love says, reach out and help them. And how do you love people? Do you tolerate everything they do? No, of course you don't. Any parent who tolerates everything his or her kid wants to do, is that parent loving? No. No, if you truly love someone, you'll stand in the way of the evil they want to do. You don't tolerate evil. In fact, if you tolerate evil, you're unloving. The way you love people is you don't tolerate evil. That's how you love people. That's how you love children. That's how you love friends. In fact, it was Thomas Sowell, the 91-year-old economist, who said this: when you tell people what they need to hear, you're helping them. When you tell people what they want to hear, you're helping yourself. Yeah, you're helping yourself when you tolerate things you know you shouldn't tolerate, because you won't tell your loved ones what they're doing is wrong, particularly because you don't want them to get mad at you. Well, look, if you truly love somebody, you'll risk them getting mad at you. You'll risk that because you love them, because you don't want them to go down a road that's going to destroy them and maybe other people along the way. You don't want them to go against God's will. But we're too scared to speak up because we're afraid that people aren't going to like us anymore. Look, your job is to do what's right and leave the results to God. So you're not commanded to be tolerant. You're commanded to be loving, and love requires that you always stand against evil. Paul says, love always protects. Love always perseveres. Love rejoices in the truth. You don't rejoice in falsehood, you rejoice in the truth. Also, if there is no God, you can't complain about the problem of evil. Why? Because if there's no God, there's no such thing as evil. Wait a minute, how can that be? Is God doing evil? No. Because evil only exists if good exists, and good only exists if God exists. You say, how does that work? Because look, evil doesn't exist on its own. Evil only exists as a lack in a good thing. Evil is like cancer. If you take all the cancer out of a good body, you got a better body. What happens if you take all the body out of the cancer? You got nothing, right? Evil is like rust in a car. If you take all the rust out of a car, you got a better car. What happens if you take all the car out of the rust? You got a Pinto. No, you got nothing, right? It only exists as a lack in a good thing. Evil exists as a lack in a good thing. So for evil to exist at all, good must exist. But for good to exist in an objective way, God must exist. So evil doesn't disprove God. Evil may prove there's a devil out there, but evil doesn't disprove God, because there'd be no such thing as evil unless there was good, and there'd be no such thing as good unless God existed. In fact, C.S. Lewis early on in his life was an atheist. He went through World War I, a terrible war, and he said there can't be a good God because there's too much injustice in the world. And then one day he had an epiphany. He recognized that his argument didn't work. And here's what he ultimately said about it. He said, as an atheist, my argument against God was that the universe seems so cruel and unjust. But how had I got this idea of just and unjust? A man does not call a line crooked unless he has some idea of a straight line. What was I comparing this universe with when I called it unjust? You see, you wouldn't know what injustice was unless you knew what justice was. You wouldn't know something was not right unless you knew something was right. You wouldn't know what immoral was unless you knew something that was moral. So evil doesn't disprove God. It shows God does exist. Now you can ask questions, why would God allow certain evils? That's a whole nother question. But you can't say that it disproves God, because the very existence of evil is a pointer to God. In fact, we can look at it this way. The shadows prove the sunshine. In order to have shadows, you have to have sunshine. In other words, in order to have evil, you have to have good. Oh, you can have sunshine without shadows. You can have good without evil, but you can't have shadows without sunshine. You can't have evil without good. This is why, by the way, when Christopher Hitchens said God is not great, how religion poisons everything, he was actually giving away the store with this title. Why? And here's, by the way, this is a picture from our second debate we had at the College of New Jersey. Look at this word poisons right here. What does poison mean? Well, it's a fun way of saying religion's evil. Well, wait a minute. How can you have something evil unless there's something good? And how can something be objectively good unless God exists? Because what we mean by objective goodness is the nature of God. So the real issue here is that religion doesn't poison everything. Everything poisons religion. Look, I poison religion because I don't live up to the pure words of Christ. In fact, in the second debate with Christopher, at one point I said to him, you know, Christopher, a lot of what you say in your book is true, that religious people have done evil things, but you're kind of proving our worldview when you say that. Because we all agree we do evil things. That's why we need a savior. If we didn't do evil things, we wouldn't need a savior. So I am a hypocrite. I can't live up to what Jesus told me to do. But if I could, I wouldn't need him. In fact, when people say I can't go to church because there's too many hypocrites down there, I always say, come on down, pal. We got room for one more. Of course, we're all hypocrites. The church is not a country club for saints. It's a hospital for sinners. Now, I know theologically we're saints. I get that, because once we trust in Christ, God sees his righteousness, not our own. But the point here is we're still going to do evil. In fact, if you or someone you know out there is staying away from Christianity because of the behavior of Christians, you just need to ask them one question. Here's the question. If somebody plays Beethoven poorly, who do you blame? You don't blame Beethoven, right? You blame the player who plays Beethoven poorly. If a player plays Beethoven poorly, that doesn't mean that Beethoven isn't still true and beautiful. Beethoven is still true and beautiful, even though people that try and imitate Beethoven can't do it or don't do it well. The same thing is true when it comes to Christianity. When Christians don't play Christ well, don't blame Christ. Don't blame Christianity. Jesus is still true and beautiful, even though we, as his followers, don't always play him in a true or beautiful way. So you need to separate the truth of Christianity from the behavior of Christians, because the behavior of Christians isn't always good. And it won't be always good. It's admitted in the Bible we're not going to be perfect, even after we believe. Hopefully there's improvement, but there's still going to be issues. We still have a human nature, in other words. So just because we don't play Christ perfectly, don't say that Christianity isn't true. Christianity is still true, even if we don't play him in a true way. Newsflash, Christianity is not made of Christians. Christianity is ultimately about Jesus. So look to Jesus, not your own or someone else's behavior. And with that, let me mention one other thing. Let's see. I don't think we have time to get into that. I do want to mention one other thing, and that is that there is a new book coming out next week or a couple weeks. It's called Hollywood Heroes, How Your Favorite Movies Reveal God. And we're going through Captain America, Iron Man, Harry Potter, Star Wars, Lord of the Rings, Batman, Wonder Woman. You going, Harry Potter? You'd be surprised how many parallels Harry Potter has to Jesus, but that's a whole nother story. I wrote this book with my son. It's a fun way to show people how the ultimate hero, Jesus of Nazareth, is in all their favorite superhero movies. And it's a fun way to get them these biblical life lessons and theological and apologetic lessons by watching movies. Now, if you go to this HollywoodHeroesBook.com, if you go to this website right now or after this seminar and pre-order the book, we're going to send you the audio version for free. But you got to follow the cues at HollywoodHeroesBook.com, and you got to pre-order it before May 3rd in order to get the audio book for free. So check that out. All right, Stephen, let me turn it back to you so we can get Dr. Hugh Ross on. Go ahead.
Thank you so much, Frank, for your amazing session. I really loved it. It was incredibly engaging, as you always are. Thank you so much. And as Frank previously mentioned, everyone, please go check out his book, Hollywood Heroes, and make sure to pre-order the book.